Hey everyone, welcome back to another build log of the newly renamed OpenTaskLite. We're getting pretty close to the end and I'm still overhauling things. In the last build log, we did a walkthrough of a pretty extensive electronics overhaul, and in this one, I want to give the base of the lamp a similar treatment. This base is one of the first components that I worked on, and it was mainly just because I needed a way to stand up this vertical rail so that I could work on other components like the motion system. And even though I've iterated on it a bunch in the background, I never replaced this base just mainly because I like it so much. It's super simple, it's almost fully 3D printed, it's been really strong and stable. Even the C-clamp and the look and feel of it and the flexibility of that piece came together to make this base design a really good fit for the project and something that was really hard to replace. But over time, as I've been using the lamp more long term, I've identified a couple of things that could be improved about the base overall. The weight and all the forces applied to the lamp are all concentrated down onto this one aluminum dowel. And on its own, that would be fine. It's plenty strong enough to support that kind of stuff. But the dowel also plays a second role as kind of a crude bearing where the plastic parts are rotating around the aluminum dowel. So it creates a situation where you have to find this perfect balance between the tolerances of these printed parts being tight enough that the lamp doesn't wobble too much while still being able to spin freely around. And what you're looking at here in this iteration is kind of the perfect equilibrium of those two constraints where the lamp does spin freely very nicely, but there is still a bit of wobble. And because it's at that equilibrium, I can't really optimize anymore in one way or the other. So I would really like to eliminate any of this wobble while still keeping the lamp spinning freely. This printed part down here is probably the single biggest point of failure on the whole lamp. And what tends to happen is if I bump into the lamp like pretty violently, like I'm reaching over it, the lamp will kind of tip over and all of that force will be concentrated right where the dowel ends on this printed part and it'll just shear right in half. So I definitely want to prevent that on the next base design if I can. Another limitation of this pretty minimal design is that there's not a great place to hide this power cable. You could probably find a way to feed it through in like a static way, but once you factor in that the lamp rotates, you kind of get into trouble. So my solution until now is just to keep a few inches of this cable exposed so you can rotate at least 360 or 720 degrees, and that's been fine. But in the interest of trying to explore the way that the Dyson solves problems, I would really like to find a way to hide this cable completely, and then that would also enable basically infinite rotation. And lastly, the rotation of this design is actually pretty good, but because of that wobble that I mentioned before, sometimes when you move very quickly, the lamp has a tendency to kind of like bind up on itself, and at high speed, the rotation just doesn't feel very good. And then kind of adjacent to that, I know that the motion system feels best when the vertical rail is super rigid. So I want to see how statically I can mount this vertical rail while still allowing rotation, just so that the motion feels as good as possible. So like I said, I've been trying to achieve some of these goals in the background. And these are a handful of my attempts to do that. They all center around this idea of replacing the aluminum dowel with a proper bearing. And my thinking is that a small bearing like this would introduce a level of precision that isn't present on the aluminum dowel, while still being strong enough to support the weight of the lamp. The trick with designing around this bearing is that there's not that much to grab onto. So basically what you end up doing is clamping onto it from both sides while keeping the inner and the outer ring of the bearing isolated. That way you're gripping onto it very tightly, but it can still rotate freely. So that's what you're seeing in this design. There's two components on the outside that clamp from the top and the bottom on the outer ring, and two components on the inside which clamp onto the inner ring. And then in addition to all that, there's one more rule, which is I need to make room for this thing. This is just a simple barrel jack, and I think this is what I want to use as like a simple rotating power connector. I also think it's what Dyson uses for their solution. I can see why, because it's a very small component, but I think it's going to allow us to do infinite rotation in the base with just a super simple off-the-shelf component. While this is a simple solution, it does need to be placed right at the center of rotation of the vertical rail. So it has to be right in the center of this bearing. So the place where I would really like to put like an M5 screw to screw the bearing right into the vertical rail is going to be occupied by the barrel jack. So that's another constraint. And that's why in the design, you see a lot of these screws going around the outer edges to keep the bearing in place. And that's just because we have to reserve the middle for the DC barrel jack. So the thing about this base is that even though it checks a lot of the boxes that I laid out earlier, And even though it's very compact and it's only like 20 or 30% bigger than the original base, there's something about the slight increase in scale of this base where this feels like a toy to me. And I do think it's largely because it's scaled up just enough that like the minimalistic feel is kind of gone. And which I know is weird because it's not that much bigger, but that's just how it comes off to me now. And it's not just the color, because I printed this off in black and white as well. Black and white. I printed it off in black, and it has the same problem. So given that this design isn't really doing it for me, even in its most compact form, I think I need to go a slightly different direction. So I think what I want to do is split into two solutions for the base. So on one end, I'll have this clamp mounted design pretty much as is, as just like a very bare bones and simple base that requires very few components and does the job. Then on the other end of the spectrum, I want to move the bearing base solution into a freestanding solution. So a larger standalone base that has a big bearing inside of it and that has plenty of room for all the problems that I need to solve. The construction method of this base actually scales up really well into a larger freestanding base, simply using a larger bearing. That being said, the bearing sandwich solution is a pretty tedious design to make work. Even though this bearing is bigger, there's still just not a lot to grab onto on these inner and outer rings, and you end up dedicating like a lot of design time to working around that, and then in the final solution there's a lot of space dedicated to solving that problem too. And so I got a little bit tired of working on that problem, and I set aside the base for a little while to work on other problems. And during that time, John in the Discord shared his DIY sim, and he had a really cool component in his design that stood out to me right away and got me excited about the base again. So the component that he shared is one of these, which is just a bearing for a Lazy Susan, and it looks a lot like the large bearing that I was using for my freestanding base, with one big difference. So this bearing still has an inner ring and an outer ring, but it also has these holes, which are meant for some rubber feet, but I want to use them for M5 screws. Rather than having to clamp down on either side of the bearing, I can just screw right into my components using these holes. And that got me excited about working on the base again. So thank you, John, for sharing this solution. I think it's going to be the perfect foundation for a freestanding base that rotates smoothly, that's rigid enough to keep the vertical rail from wobbling, and I think there's enough room in this interior for the DC barrel jack so that it can spin infinitely. I don't know for sure if it's going to work yet, but I'm going to make some prototypes now and I'll check back in with you to see how they work. So a couple thoughts on this prototype so far. I was pretty worried at first because it felt like this amount of wobble was going to be a big problem, but once the horizontal rail and the carriage are on, you start using it the way that it's meant to be used, it feels really good. It's actually less wobble than the old solution, and I've kind of accepted that I'm probably not going to eliminate all the wobble, and as long as it feels really good, I'm okay with that. A couple of things I'm looking at now are when I try to move the lamp without holding it down, you can see that it tips over really easily. So I think there probably will be a sweet spot radius where it tends to stay upright even when I'm trying to lift the lamp up, and obviously some added weight will help with that too. Loading up the vertical rail with all the other components, especially the counterweight, will help a lot. But what I also hope to do, and I think what would be the most economical way to weigh down the base, is to use all the remaining lead balls from the counterweight and distribute those into the base as well. And you probably already noticed that I'm using the aluminum carriage that Jake CNC'd for me, and I'm always happy when I get to do that because it feels really, really good. I hope I can get one on the final DIY soon. Also in the next version, I need to think about a permanent way to attach the rail to this inner ring. And right now I just slid it in and that seems to be doing well. But I want to try some options for securing it in place long term, and integrating that does have implications on the overall design. So I want to add that as soon as I can. And obviously I haven't thought at all about how the DC barrel jack is going to be integrated here, so that's going to come up in the future prototypes too. After a couple days of modeling, test fitting, and tweaking, I was able to assemble the next iteration. This design looks remarkably like the bearing base design and consists of an upper piece which connects the bearing to the vertical rail. And underneath that, there's this plate for mounting the barrel jack. Surrounding this, there's a big outer shell which will eventually get screwed to the bearing's outer ring. And this all sits on a base piece that accommodates the power plug by adding a bit more height and this channel for hiding the cable. Not too many surprises here, but my favorite highlight is the way the vertical rail attaches. I've tried a number of solutions of this over the years, and this is by far the simplest and most successful. There's these two spring-loaded nuts that are inserted into opposing rail channels, and two M5 screws coming in through the top piece. This is a very indirect way to screw two things together, but the screws end up pulling these nuts outward and against the inner wall of the channel, and that holds the rail in place super snugly and pretty discreetly. So with that ironed out and all the parts fully assembled, this thing turns out to be a pretty big boy, standing at 46 millimeters tall and 170 millimeters in diameter. The overall diameter doesn't actually bother me so much, but the height is a bit excessive and it feels out of place with the rest of the lamp in my eyes. The driving factor behind the height is the combined height of the mated power plug and jack, which accounts for about 76% of the total base height. So we have to find a way to slim things down. I'm already using one trick to reduce the visual footprint. I like to call it the MacBook Air trick, where you have this floating overhang which obscures a bit of the true height of the base and makes it look like it's a bit slimmer and also kind of floating off the table surface. Tricks like this are handy, but if I'm going to move forward with this base design, I think I'm going to have to find a way to reduce the base's actual height and not just the perceived height, and I'm going to need every millimeter that I can get. The first place I'm looking is towards the vertical rail. It's currently submerged 1 centimeter into the base and accounts for most of the non-power plug height. This 1 centimeter depth is a hard requirement with this design because that's how much space these M5 screws take up within the top piece. So basically the diameter of this screw head is the driving factor behind the depth of the vertical rail. And if we just swap this screw out for an M3 screw and the nuts for M3 nuts, suddenly that screw is smaller and we can submerge the vertical rail a bit less and save up to about 4 millimeters here. We can also claw back about 2 millimeters at these terminals if we trim off the top half and just solder the wires a bit lower down. So combined, that's about 6 millimeters gain. Outside of that, there's not much I can do to reduce the actual height of the base, but there's a bit more we can do on the design side. I can trim some of the excess volume around the perimeter and carefully sculpt this big main outer piece, keeping the same height at the interior, but reducing the height around the perimeter. And hopefully this is enough to make the base feel slim, even if it's only actually shrunk by 6 millimeters. Man, we really have expanded upon the base today, and you can expand your base of knowledge with today's sponsor, Brilliant. One of the reasons that I built the OpenTask Lite around CircuitPython is that I just love Python as a programming language. Not only is it versatile and pretty easy to learn, but I know that when I'm building my Python skills on one project, those skills are likely to carry over onto my other projects, and I really like that. So if you're planning on building your own OpenTask Lite and you'd like to customize it, now would be a really good time to either learn Python for the first time or just brush up on your Python skills, and Brilliant can help you do that. Brilliant is a learning app that uses hands-on learning and problem solving to help you get smarter every day. With their interactive lessons in math, science, programming, and AI, you can build your own daily habit centered around learning and personal growth. Specifically, Brilliant has a course called Programming with Python, where you can learn Python and coding concepts in general by working with real code from day one, which helps build a real intuitive sense of how code is supposed to work. To try everything Brilliant has to offer for free for 30 days, visit brilliant.org/Stephen Bennett or check out this QR code or click the link in the description. There you'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription. So go learn some Python, and thank you, Brilliant. So after implementing those space-saving measures, I was able to cut the height down by about 4 millimeters. So just shy of that 6 millimeter mark, but still pretty good. And looking at this base, I think that the design improvements are doing a lot to make it feel a lot slimmer than it did before. And overall, I think it really matches the overall aesthetic of the lamp. The final test is going to be adding those M3 nuts to secure the rail, but those are still in the mail, so it's going to have to wait for another day. It's funny, this is by far the biggest part of the whole lamp, and when I first started working on it, it felt like such a luxury to have that much space. But once you factor in the height of the plug and you start optimizing around that, it very quickly became this familiar game of chasing millimeters and trying to optimize towards compactness again. I think as far as optimization goes, this is pretty close to as slim as I'm going to get the base. I did find a new plug that would save 1.3 millimeters, but at this point in the project, I think redesigning the base just to save a millimeter is a bit silly. I'm not sure that I'm willing to go there, but I am. And so this is the updated base. So with this base, we do save that 1.3 millimeters, which is noticeable. And beyond that, I also took this opportunity to widen the base a little bit, both for stability and because I think the proportions look a little bit better. So with that little bit of extra space squeezed out, I think the last thing to do is I need to design like a little door to keep the weighted material inside the base, but I think you've seen enough of the base so far for this build log, so I'll do that off camera and I'll update you later. And this should be the end of the build log, but I'm hoping that you'll go down one more rabbit hole with me, because while I was working on the freestanding base, I had a small epiphany about the clamping base that I want to share with you. In my office, I have this ball which is used to roll out tight muscles, and whenever I put it down on this desk surface, I usually put it on top of this roll of electrical tape so it doesn't roll away. While I was working on the base, I have all these bearings lying around, and so it was inevitable that I'd pick one up, put it on top of this ball, and fidget with it. And as I did that, I thought, man, that feels pretty good. And it gives me an idea for the clamping base. Like I mentioned, the clamping base is dead simple, but it has some quirks. If the fit between the printed base and the spacer is too tight, the parts won't spin freely, and too loose, and you get wobble. Then there's that weak point where the spacer meets the plastic. Originally, I wanted to do the obvious solution, which is to screw the spacer directly into the rail, but I always worried that as the screw rotates, the hard metal edge would eat into the plastic below it, or worse, that the rotation would cause the screw to slowly loosen over time. That's where this comes in. To me, this looks like a potential solution to this problem. Here, the tape is a short aluminum spacer, the recovery ball is a hardened steel ball, and the bearing is the screw-spacer combo. These combined do two things. It protects the plastic of the base from the rotating steel screw, and it lowers the resistance on the screw head significantly, making it very unlikely that it could ever unscrew itself. This improvement completely fixes the strength issues from before, but to maximize smoothness and minimize wobble, I have one more modification in mind. Instead of inserting the spacer directly into the plastic, what if we use something like this? This is a bronze sleeve bearing that just fits around the outside of the aluminum spacer. If we can integrate this into the clamping base design, it should result in a tighter fit with minimal friction. By the way, have you ever seen bronze in person? I think this is the first time that I've ever seen it, and I'm pretty blown away just by like how gorgeous it is. Gold and silver seem to get a lot of attention, but this is like one of the best materials I've ever seen in person. I might have to start using it on more projects. Anyway, I've modified the clamping base so that the sleeve bearing fits snugly inside, and I've just had this sitting off on the side of my desk waiting to put it in here because I have a feeling it's going to be pretty satisfying, so I wanted to do it with you on camera. So here we go. Ooh, that's pretty good. Well, there's no getting it out now. So now I'm just going to add the spacer. And this is a 6mm steel ball. So now I should just be able to put in the spacer. That's weird. Am I using the wrong ball? It's kind of getting stuck. And it's not spinning freely. I wonder if it's... Okay, I figured it out. So it's a design issue. So there's a little gap between the sleeve bearing and the spacer on the bottom, and it's supposed to be filled by the ball so that the longer spacer never reaches that gap, because if it does, that area is exactly 10 millimeters around, and if this touches that, it's going to introduce a lot of friction. So to prove that, I just inserted a slightly larger steel ball, and that essentially lifts up the spacer and stops it from reaching that plastic part. And with that in place, it spins really, really smoothly. And I'll just have to modify the design a little bit because I want to use a smaller ball. So that's pretty easy. The hard part is going to be getting this sleeve bearing out now that I've inserted it in there. I might have to saw this in half. So I fixed it, and I also made a little bit of a change. So it turns out that these sleeve bearings, the wider walled version is actually a little bit cheaper than the thin wall version, which is cool because the wide wall version looks even slightly better than the thin wall version. So I fixed the design with this one, and when it's inserted, the rotation is super smooth, and we have the wider wall, which looks awesome, I think. Now I can screw the spacer directly into the vertical rail using a long screw, and hopefully when I insert it into the sleeve bearing, it's a nice snug fit. With this change, the motion is super smooth, but it hasn't fully eliminated wobble. I think that's because we're pairing a high precision sleeve bearing with a relatively low precision spacer, and until we swap the spacer out for something precise like a bushing, there will always likely be a small gap. I'll keep an eye out for a more precise spacer in the future, but for now, this is a huge improvement over the previous design. There are a few spacer and sleeve bearing combos that fit together, so there is room for some self-expression and personal preference here. One word of caution, the one that I'm using is a bronze alloy and has a small amount of lead in that alloy. So if you go with this one, please do take proper precautions. Man, I really didn't think that the freestanding base would be this complicated, but I'm really glad to see it all coming together. And the clamping base with the addition of this sleeve bearing is now competing with the carriage for one of my favorite parts on the lamp. I'm curious which version of the base you'll use if you build your own OpenTask light. Personally, I'm having a hard time deciding, so I might just end up alternating between the two. Oh, and I realized I never showed you how the power cable connects to the DC barrel jack. I'm using another one of these micro lock cables, and it just feeds through this little hole down to the DC jack. We're getting dangerously close to finishing the OpenTask light, and in the next build log, I'll have the new PCBs for the control board and for the SuperTrax, and I'm really excited because I finally get to finalize the design of the carriage. There's also a couple of experiments that I have in mind for the next build log, so I hope you'll join me there for that. Thank you so much to my patrons who make going down rabbit holes like this possible. Without you all, I may not have experimented to this extent with the clamping base upgrade. So seriously, thank you so much for your help. And thanks to all of you for watching. I really appreciate your support over the years, for sticking with me, for having enthusiasm for this weird project. I really appreciate it. So thank you, and I'll see you in the next one.